We're about ready to get going. The Canadian Philosophy Show. The Canadian Philosophy Show. We have an interesting show today. Somewhat controversial. At least some people think so. I don't think it's so controversial.
Neither do I.
It's so controversial, there's only two of us that showed up for the show. Tagen Marshall from Vancouver Island University. You're some complicated combination of what? Third year and second year student or something? I never can quite get it straight.
Yeah, I have a second year standing credits, but this is my third year attending VIU, so.
Okay. So you
Thanks.
fully disclosed your status. No one can accuse you of misrepresenting yourself.
No,
and,
exactly.
You're a philosophy major,
Which I think is key with this discussion of misrepresentation.
Good. Right, that's going to come up. And my name is Michael Robert Caditz. I am an alumnus of Vancouver Island University, but it's still fresh in my mind, Tagen. I can picture myself right now sitting in the social sciences building, and I know the chair that I sat in always. In fact, it was everyone knew it was my chair for multiple classes. You know how most of the classes are, like one or two, about 2 or 3 different rooms, right? Most of the philosophy classes. Maybe you don't know. You're online now, right? You don't even go to the physical school anymore, do you?
I miss our campus, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I lived at that campus for actually about 3 years. And if another student mistakenly sat in my chair, I would often get an apology. Oh, Michael, I'm so sorry. Sorry, I sat in your chair. Even if I wasn't in the class, students in other classes that I wasn't in would feel guilty that they were sitting in my chair during the class that I wasn't in, because they thought of it as my chair, and it just felt strange to them to see someone else, or for them to be the person sitting in my chair. Didn't have my name on it, but I guess it had my aura and energy around it, right?
Yeah. See, I never had that problem, because my chair goes wherever I go.
Exactly. Yeah, you have your own chair. That's an advantage. One of the silver linings for you. You get your own chair that you know fits you well, right?
It's true. And no one else can sit in it. I'm just a constant presence. But when I walk into the room, you can sure see the hustle and bustle to get out of my way. I cannot make a quiet entrance.
See, you have a number of advantages.
Exactly.
Yeah, there were some students that everyone gets in their way on purpose.
Yeah. No one's shoving me up against a locker.
Yeah, well, I hope the pandemic ends as soon as possible, and you can get back to your actual physical classroom. So, so what is so controversial for some people about today? Well, our topic is going to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you want to say it differently, Taken, because it was actually your topic. Why don't you introduce it? It was your idea. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Michael. The topic for tonight is, how do we, as philosophy students and philosophers in general, determine what is beneficial and what is harmful to our discipline? I'm focusing mainly, and I think I can do this because there's only 2 of us here, on the work of Martin Heidegger, who has quite famously been kind of, shall we say, not necessarily denounced, but definitely has a negative connotation to his philosophy because of some personal life choices. So how do we as philosophers determine if we should keep someone's philosophy despite their personal decisions or throw it out entirely?
Right. So, to paraphrase in my own words, what is the relationship between a philosopher's work, or his or her philosophy, and his or her personal life, and should it matter? Is there any connection? If there is, what is it? And if there's not, why should it matter what a philosopher does in his or her personal life, no matter how objectionable it might be? And as you mentioned, one example of where this has come to the forefront is with Martin Heidegger, because of the fact that he was a German and actually was a member of the Nazi Party for a short period of time. I think a year, right?
Yeah.
But he's also a very well-known philosopher, and for many of us, not every one of us, but many of us find a lot of value in his work. I know you've expressed that, Tagen. But before we get there, I wanted to give a little background. We're not only talking about Heidegger, we're talking about I'll give an example of another philosopher where this issue has come up, and there's many other philosophers. Even Nietzsche has come into question, and many other philosophers. But I'm going to start with something, Tagen, and you can feel free to interrupt me at any time if you want to comment.
Okay. You know I will.
Yeah. It's nice to only have two people. It's a little bit easier to be spontaneous. So I want to talk about what's known as the genetic fallacy. It's one of the logical fallacies that we study in philosophy. So rather than just take my word for it, I researched a few different sites here which talk about the fallacy, and they explain it in different ways. So here's one way of defining the genetic fallacy. Basing the truth claim of an argument on the origin of its claims or premises. So here's an example given. Lisa was brainwashed as a child into thinking that people are generally good. Therefore, people are not generally good. So that's actually kind of a twist example with a twist of the genetic fallacy. The explanation about why that statement's a fallacy is that the fact that Lisa may have been brainwashed as a child is irrelevant to the claim that people are generally good.
Right.
So here's a second example. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think that also comes back to appealing to the person fallacy as well. Because appealing to the fact that Lisa was brainwashed as a child would then state that, well, her opinion that all people are good is faulty.
Right. So related to the genetic fallacy. It has to do with the source rather than the content, right?
Correct.
Here's another example from this site. He was born to Catholic parents and raised as a Catholic until his confirmation in 8th grade. Therefore, he is bound to want to defend some Catholic traditions, and therefore cannot be taken seriously. So
exactly. There's so much wrong there, because to make the assumption that just because he's grown up part of a community, he's automatically gonna almost have a herd mentality and not want to investigate or question things is faulty. That's a hasty generalization.
Yeah. And a genetic fallacy, and which brings up the point that oftentimes statements can be viewed in more than one light and actually can be viewed as containing more than one fallacy at the same time. How about this one, Tagen? I believe in closet monsters because my big sister told me unless I do whatever she tells me, the closet monsters will eat me.
Oh, poor child. There must be some real good sibling rivalry growing up inside of him when he discovers that closet monsters don't exist.
Yes, but he thinks they do because his sister told him. That's the genetic
Yeah,
fallacy.
exactly.
Because it came from his sister, it must be true.
Yeah, exactly. Because he trusts them, and I think that is inherent to the common human experience, that we trust people. And I think an argument can be made using these examples. I don't agree with it, but I could see some people saying, very kind of sadly saying, well, we shouldn't trust anybody because they could be lying to us. And it's like, yeah, they could, but we also go in good faith and knowing that, hoping we can trust them, but that doesn't mean we stop questioning at any point.
But this example brings up an interesting question, which is it always a fallacy to trust what people say without your having firsthand knowledge of the claim? It seems like it's not always a fallacy if the person is trustworthy.
Mm.
I haven't personally witnessed many of the claims that scientists make. Uh,
But we trust them because we assume that they have good motives. And I think that's where in this example, we see that the sister doesn't have good motives. She has
mhm.
selfish motives to benefit herself, and in that sense, she she is creating what Martin Buber would describe. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mikey, but I'm pretty sure this is what um, um, Martin Buber would describe almost as an I-it type relationship, in the sense that the and in contrast to an I-thou relationship where it would be a reciprocal relationship. There is no reciprocity for the little brother here, so it's more of an I-it relationship, or is it more an I? Isn't there a third one that's like an othering relationship?
I you or
I
I know
think it. I think. I think it might even be I them, but
yeah, we'll
I'm
have to
gonna.
research that when we do our Martin Buber. We're gonna do a Martin Buber show. But anyway, I get your point. It's an issue of trust. Uh, so we this is an interesting thing about fallacies is is fallacies sometimes are a matter of degree, not a matter of kind, and that's what I'm trying
Hmm.
to show here, which is that depending on how trustworthy the source is and how much of an authority on the topic at hand the source is, it might not be a fallacy to believe something because of its source. If let's take an example of I don't know if you're up on the politics or the COVID politics in the United States, but it can be documented fairly well that almost everything that President Trump has said about the COVID uh, pandemic is false, and and whereas in contrast, uh, we could expect that what some of the epidemiologists and doctors that are authoritative, like Dr. Fauci, for example, what they say seems to be correct. So, would it be a logical fallacy to disregard something that Trump says, but believe something that Dr. Fauci says? I'm not sure that it would be fallacious because of
Yeah.
the track record and the credentials and the authoritativeness of each of those persons.
Well, it might not be, but also President Trump is not in a medical position, so you have to question immediately from a medical standpoint, like his motives, I don't think are medical. His motives are more, and we can debate the rationality of this, but his motives were more, let's keep the people calm so there isn't this state of hysteria. However, unfortunately, humans are humans, and this is a scary time for a lot of people. So, yeah, in a sense, we can disregard what President Trump has said about the virus itself, but I don't think we can totally discount him on his motive, or on his job to bring as much as he can, um, shall we say, reassurance to a nation. And we can debate whether he's done that, but I think that's just a difference.
Yeah.
I think
Here,
it's different if go ahead. I'll just say one thing. I think it's different if someone claims to be a doctor and makes extraneous claims or underplaying claims. I think it's another if you're a different person and you're just trying to bring comfort to a people group.
right. Yeah, and what we're showing here by this conversation is it's not always easy to clearly identify
Yeah.
when we have a fallacy, when the origin of the claim is taken into consideration. Maybe we have a fallacy, maybe we don't.
Yeah.
But here's another. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say here's another definition of genetic fallacy from another site. Accepting or rejecting a claim based on its origin instead of judging it by its merits. Just another way of expressing the same concept.
Yeah, no, it's so true, right? And that, sorry, can you repeat that definition?
Accepting or rejecting a claim based on its origin instead of judging it by its merits.
And I think this is I don't know if you agree, but I think this is the perfect segue into discussing the philosophers we're going to discuss.
Yeah,
Because
almost, yeah.
we the people we are going to talk about today, Heidegger, Nietzsche, whoever you want to bring in, Michael, as well, is going to be just that. Is sometimes, because of a person's actions, we can judge them too quickly. We can judge their work too quickly. Or as one of our co-host colleagues who's not with us today stated, it's easier to judge the artist and then judge the artwork. Or we're judging the artwork, so Heidegger's philosophy, whoever, bought by the artist's reputation, and that's not fair to the artwork itself. So.
Let me talk about, before we get to Heidegger, I want to talk about a contemporary philosopher, John Searle, who was a professor at University of California, Berkeley. So first I want to briefly talk about one of his significant philosophical contributions, a thought experiment called the Chinese Room. And I'm going to read here from my reference. Searle asks you to imagine the following scenario. There is a room. Sometimes people come to the room with a piece of paper, which they slip into the room through a slot. Then they wait a while until the same piece of paper comes back out of a room through a second slot. You soon discover that the people slipping the paper into the room are native Chinese speakers who are sending questions into the room. Let's imagine that they have written the following question, and then I'm looking at some Chinese characters. And the description of the figure is, the caption is, this question in Chinese means, what brings happiness? So when the paper is later passed out of the room, the Chinese speakers discover that an answer has been written below the question. The answer is also in Chinese, and the native speakers determine that it is, in fact, a wise answer to the question. And I'm looking now at some Chinese characters, and the caption translates them as, "Be the stream of the universe." So when the Chinese speakers receive intelligent answers to their questions, they reasonably conclude that there is an intelligent person inside the room who understands Chinese. But in this thought experiment, we are to imagine that the only person inside of the room actually understands no Chinese and speaks only English. For the sake of discussion, we will assume that it is John Searle himself. You can assume, if you like, that it is you in the room. Anyone who doesn't speak Chinese. The room is full of books, and messages are passed into the room with symbols written on them. And Searle's job, or the person inside of the room, has a job to look through the books until he finds the string of symbols that look exactly like the ones written on the piece of paper. When he finds that string of symbols, the book will tell him, in English, what new string of symbols he is to write on the bottom of the page, and then pass back out of the room. So Searle does actually not recognize any of the symbols. They are simply meaningless shapes. For all he knows, they may be nothing more than patterns for making wallpaper and not a language at all. But as it turns out, the symbols do have meanings, and they're Chinese symbols. And more than that, they are questions in Chinese being asked by intelligent speakers. But when the intelligent speakers get the paper output that Searle puts back out to them, they think that there's a Chinese speaker inside of the room because they got an answer that made sense. So Searle's argument is that the books that Searle is using to take the symbols and write other symbols that to the Chinese speakers make sense, that they function as a computer program. Each page gives instructions for how to manipulate symbols. So this argument is a very famous thought experiment, and it's designed to illustrate, to explicate the concept that there's a distinction between the syntactic manipulation of symbols that a computer program can do, that a computational system can do. There's a big distinction between that and the meaning of symbols to a human mind. So it's similar to maybe to if a human looks at a photograph, it means something. It brings ideas of a beautiful sunset in the photograph. You can recall the sunset. You can almost feel what it was like when you yourself saw a sunset like that. Or if you haven't, you can just experience the quality. You have this qualitative experience of the awe and the beauty of a sunset. But a computer program or some digital scanner could scan the pixels, because the photograph, after all, is made up of little pixels. It could scan the pixels, and know every pixel and the coordinates of every pixel and the color of every pixel and the brightness of every pixel, but never, that computer program would never have the qualitative experience of a sunset. So that's what Searle is illustrating with the Chinese room argument. So the reason I went off on this tangent was I wanted you to get a little bit of, and the listeners to get a little bit of richness of one of the things that Searle has helped teach. One of the things he's contributed to the discipline of philosophy. No, he wasn't the one that first thought of the idea that there's something more to a photograph than pixels, or something more to language than the symbols. But he really developed, this thought experiment, the Chinese room, which really helps to make it more clear. So
it helps make it real. It helps it,
right,
in a sense. It helps give a context, a grounding to the individual, so that it's more real to them. In that sense, it holds more meaning than just, machines don't experience the experiences we do.
Right.
They don't have the fullness. Right? There's just more sensory experience even within that, because you have the images. You have people. You can conjure it up in your mind, and therefore it becomes more real to you.
Yes, and as we have discovered, and you're discovering, and I've discovered, in the discipline of philosophy, that's one very effective way to make points and explicate the some of the problems that we're facing is by these thought experiments. And so when someone like Searle comes up with these very, very clear and then they become very well known thought experiments, that's a major contribution to the discipline. So now we're getting back on the main track here, which is for me to now go to this next bit of information, which is that Searle, who's I guess he's pretty old. He's in his maybe 80s or something. Anyway, he was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley since 1959. But in 2019, so just a little over a year ago, he was stripped of his emeritus status at University of California, Berkeley, owing to the finding that he violated the university's sexual harassment policies. Searle was sued for sexual harassment in 2017, and the university had received prior complaints about him of sexual harassment. A recent email to graduate students in Berkeley's Department of Philosophy states, John Searle is no longer affiliated with UC Berkeley, following a determination that he violated university policies against sexual harassment. President Napolitano has ended his emeritus status. That means, among other things, he is no longer eligible to teach or advise students, nor will he have access to the campus beyond what is afforded to any member of the general public. It is not clear whether this determination is related to the 2017 lawsuit or some other instance or instances of sexual harassment. In any case, I won't go on, but there's a lot of other discussion, and apparently number of women came forward, and he was stripped of his prestigious status at the University of California, Berkeley, and that brings us closer to the crux of our topic here, which is
Correct.
How does this, or should it affect, how does this disposition of Searle's personal life or work life because of personal, well, actually, some of the accusations had to do with him, the way he treated students, so it was at work. But how does this relate, if it does relate at all, to his philosophical contributions, and should it at all color or change the way we assess or the value that we give, or the authoritativeness we provide his philosophy, his philosophical theories?
I think that's a great question, and it is always hard for us in the philosophical community when we see someone who has had such an impact on our discipline fall from grace like that. But to answer the question, I think it will regardless. It will regardless. The question of should it, I don't think so. Because an individual's work is separate from their personal actions. You could say, and we'll see this when we get into Heidegger, well, maybe some of their beliefs and some of their actions can be demonstrated within their work. But if we want to determine whether he should be thrown out, I use that strong language just because it was the first thing that came to mind. Whether he should be discredited, we have to go to the work itself, because we have to determine, first of all, what is philosophy but the love of wisdom. What is the job of a philosopher but to pursue truth and to pursue wisdom? So if we want to do that, if we want to determine whether work should be discredited, we have to go to the work itself. We can't go to the man fully. We can't go to the author because, yeah, the author may have done terrible things, but that does not reflect the quality of the work. That thought experiment, despite personal actions, that needs to be separated from his personal actions, because the thought experiment itself is what we're looking at. We're not looking at the person and saying, because philosophy isn't about people, it's about knowledge. And so to look at his knowledge and to say, does this knowledge present a major issue for philosophy as a whole? Yes or no? To then go to that, to do an in-depth study of that and say, okay, in light of this, do we need to throw this out? I would say no. But I think there is a hasty generalization that we automatically connect the two, because yes, a philosopher can't be entirely separated from his work. That's true, because the work comes through a human being. But the work is one thing. The personal actions is another. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Going back to our examples that I gave around the genetic fallacy, it seems like the genetic fallacy went both ways. It would be fallacious to discredit someone's claims merely because of their origin. But also, there was an example there of giving undue credit to someone's claim because of its origin. In other words, if you trust somebody's claim merely because it came from that person, that could be fallacious, unless that person is authoritative and you have reason to trust that person's claims.
Right.
So it becomes complicated. So in this case of Searle, we might maybe the answer to the question of should we discredit his work because of what we've found out about his personal decisions or his work decisions, we might have to ask ourselves, say with regards to the Chinese room thought experiment, do we find value in that thought experiment merely because it came from John Searle, or is there something intrinsically useful and valuable in that thought experiment? Right. So I would say that if the reason I find value in the thought experiment is because I know its origin, that would be a genetic fallacy. If I would find value in that thought experiment without regard, irrespective of its origin, then I would say that it would be a genetic fallacy to discredit it merely because it came from John Searle.
Right. And this is it, right? Before you read me the bit about the sexual harassment accusations and issues, I thought it was just a beautiful, beautiful analogy of the human experience. And I think you've just hit it on the head, right? We as philosophers, again, I'll reiterate this time and time again. Yes, the person is important. Yes, the author is important. And if there is something that comes up, we should investigate that. But that experiment of itself says nothing of the person. That experiment speaks for itself because it is relatable to the human existence. Just as there's aspects of Nietzsche, which I'm sure we can get into, that some have debated, well, Nietzsche's got to go. Well, hang on a second. Because even if Nietzsche was a bad guy, even if Husserl was a bad dude, even if Heidegger was a bad dude, and I don't mean to just point out guys here, but they're the people coming to mind. That doesn't matter as long as their philosophy benefits the discipline, as long as we can learn from that. We don't have to inflate their decisions into their work.
Okay, but let me just propose one other scenario where this is in response to what you're saying, Tagen, where maybe we would want to take into consideration the source of the claim. What if the work itself, the philosophical work, actually reflected the unacceptable views or practices of its originator? And or slightly different nuance of that is, what if it actually promoted malevolent or unjust phenomena in society? So is there anything in the Chinese room thought experiment that we might identify as in some way promoting or reflecting abuse of women or misogynistic behavior? I haven't found it. Because the Chinese room thought experiment is you know, as I said before, is meant to really make clear the distinction between human consciousness and the computations of a computer. It's not evident to me at this point how Searle's treatment of women would have anything to do with that. Maybe there is something in there, but I haven't thought of it yet. So, but I think it's an important question to ask. So before we take up too much time on Searle, I want to move on to your example of Heidegger, and let's look at those questions. What is the value in Heidegger's philosophy? So could you, I know you've been studying Heidegger, could you tell us a little bit about Heidegger, and what the value is in his philosophy, and then tell us about what his crime was, right? And whether you think there's any relationship between his involvement with the Nazi Party and his work.
Sure, I can do that, no problem. So Martin Heidegger is one of the fundamental philosophers and creators of what is known as phenomenology. So the study and the uncovering of a phenomenon. Martin Heidegger, as Mikey has already pointed out, is known, unfortunately and most famously, for his connection to the Nazi Party, and that is the biggest critique and criticism of Martin Heidegger's philosophy and why it should not be read. But before I get into more of the social stigma which Heidegger carries around, let me briefly introduce you to his philosophy and his thinking, if that's okay with you, Mikey.
Please, I would love to hear that.
Martin Heidegger, as I said, is foundational to developing what is known as phenomenology, in particular, a method of phenomenology. Martin Heidegger, along with his long-term friend and supervisor Edmund Husserl, discussed and created what is known as the method of phenomenology, which is the method to uncover the phenomenon of something. Heidegger Heidegger's primary work, which I have right here conveniently, is called Being and Time. Being and Time. And what he sets out to do in Being and Time is to reawaken what it means to be, what it means to what being actually is. What does it mean to exist? And he begins his book by saying, by criticizing the traditional philosophical thought, by saying, even by the time of Plato and Aristotle, the question of what it meant to be, and I'm paraphrasing, had started to be forgotten. So Heidegger's goal in Being and Time, which is only like 2/3 of what it was meant to be, sets out to discover what being is and how being interacts with the world. So he also, in this book, presents an introduction to an entirely new philosophical vocabulary. The primary focus of this is Dasein. Dasein is being. Dasein exists as Heidegger presents the idea that Dasein is our very being. Dasein is us. And that Dasein interacts with the world through experience. So it reaches out into the world and looks for a response and works through possibilities presented to it. So Being in Time is what Heidegger is most famously known for. Perhaps it's easier, Mikey, if you ask me some questions and I answer them for you, just so we don't run out of time.
I would like to ask you something that would be relevant, if you have any insight into this.
Sure.
Are you aware, in your studies of Heidegger, are you aware of anything in his philosophy which somehow relates to Nazism, or might encourage Nazism, or reflect Nazism? The question is, are we looking at a situation with Heidegger which is sort of analogous to Searle's situation, where there doesn't seem to be any linkage between personal life and philosophy? Or is there something, is Heidegger pushing a philosophy that somehow entails or lends itself to Nazi philosophy that you're aware of?
Not to my knowledge, and I have done research on this. I have questioned individuals I respect within the discipline to this question, and they have said no, they couldn't find anything either. So to my knowledge, to my limited study, I can't find anything. And I think, Mikey, if I could, I better explain why Martin Heidegger joined the Nazi Party.
Okay.
Because that is central. That's really central to demolishing the claim. Because, as I've stated to you before, and I want to say right here, right now, I do not support Heidegger's actions. I do not support. In fact, I condone.
You condemn
Nazism.
You condemn Nazism.
Yeah, I can. Sorry. I condemn Nazism and all of that which comes along with it. But to Heidegger, not to Heidegger. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in, I think it must have been, I think it was 1934. Why did he do this? Heidegger was Heidegger was offered the rectorship at the University of Freiburg in Freiburg, Germany. In order to do this, he had to join the party in order to get this position. His goal with this position was as the Nazis started to come into power and come into influence, he hoped that he would be given an opportunity to reignite a free exchange of ideas and philosophies within the university. It is important to note that Martin Heidegger stepped down no more than a year later from that position, when realizing that that was not possible. And people would get after Heidegger because he never formally renounced his membership. But here's an interesting thing to note on Heidegger's philosophy alone. His rectoral address, so the address he gave as he was rector to Freiburg, was banned by the Nazi Party for not supporting the ideologies expressed. And I think also within that we need to make the separation that this was 1935, and we need to try and I would argue, and I can take, I would argue that there needs to be a separation between his Nazi affiliation and the assumption that because of that he was anti-Semitic. Because I think the idea that he is anti-Semitic is fueling the response and therefore reception of his philosophy.
So someone might listen to your explanation about why Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, which was that he wanted a position at the university, and that was a requirement, right, at the time in Germany, and say, well, that's no excuse. Just because it was 1930, whatever year it was, and that's what was expected, is no excuse to do it, to go along with the Nazis or to join the Nazi Party. Just as it didn't turn out to be an excuse in courts of law, criminal courts around the world, for Nazi guards to say, well, I was just following orders. I just happened to be in the German military, and it happened to be Nazi, and I was just doing what I was told, like any other soldier would have done. That didn't fly, right? In the Nuremberg trials, it didn't fly in the Hague, it didn't fly in other courts. But that's not what we have here. We don't have Heidegger perpetrating Nazi crimes. We're not saying that Heidegger perpetrated crimes, killed people or acted as a Nazi soldier, or that he even wrote Nazi propaganda. In fact, your research, my research, and many philosophers and historians who've researched this also have trouble coming up with anything in Heidegger's philosophy that's clearly pro-Nazism. So this isn't that example. This isn't an example of someone who acted in an evil way and then tried to absolve him or herself of responsibility by saying, I was just doing orders, or that's what everybody did. So that's not the situation here. Now, having said that, I do want to say that we are just a couple guys on a philosophy show, and we're not authoritative, and there have been many historians and philosophers who are still researching Heidegger's philosophy and analyzing it and looking at it from different angles. And I'm sure there are some who have found something, who find some things in Heidegger's philosophy that they say might have been used or useful or influenced Nazism.
Correct.
But again, that doesn't necessarily make Heidegger himself guilty. But
And
yeah,
but that also doesn't that doesn't that also does not necessarily reflect the entirety of his work. Even
right.
if they found one quotation that could, be iffy, the entirety of his work is not tarnished by that.
Right. So if we're looking for what's morally right, we have to ask ourselves, if we were to throw out a philosopher's work or discredit it, or if we were a university and we banned the teaching of that philosopher's work, or if we're a professor at a university and won't teach that philosopher's work, are we depriving students, are we depriving society of some valuable information? In the case of Searle, it's clear to me we would be. In the case of Heidegger, you're more of an authority on Heidegger than I am, but I see value in his work and in his viewpoints. But having said all this, since you made it clear, I want to make it completely clear that I am no apologist for Nazism or Nazi ideas. Not at all. Zero. I completely condemn Nazism. And I'm asking myself, is it reasonable and is it morally correct to advocate throwing out an entire body of philosophical work because of this association Heidegger had with the Nazi Party, which we may or may not be able to excuse? But in any case, I mean, right, because you could argue that Heidegger shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have become a member of the Nazi Party for any reason, even if he had to give up the promotion or the job at the university. And maybe that's the case.
Right.
But even if that's the case, do we throw out all of his work?
Yeah, and we're also committing a fallacy by saying, well, he shouldn't have done that, because we're speaking from 2020. We're speaking from an understanding of what the Nazis did do. I think but more to your question, it is a mistake. And I will fully admit that it is a mistake. And I stand by this statement very strongly. That Heidegger's work, because that's what I'm most familiar with, should be discredited because of one decision that he thought was going to better the university in which he taught. He stepped down from that position. His work of his rectoral address was banned by the Nazi Party. In fact, and this is why I say we must separate his choice to be a Nazi from being anti-Semitic, even though that's hard to do, seeing as what the Nazis did was very that way.
Are you saying that Heidegger was anti-Semitic?
No, I'm saying he wasn't, but I'm
Yeah.
saying in order to make a clear distinction, we have to try and separate it, to look at it critically. Because if there was anti-Semitism in here, that would be more of a valid case to really critically assess his viewpoints.
So if we could find specific pieces of his philosophy that were anti-Semitic or in some way pro-Nazi or or espousing the some of the principles that Nazism relied upon in its theories and its philosophy, then that might be a different question. But it sounds like those things have not been clearly identified in his work. Not that some researchers or historians haven't tried to make associations, and maybe they have, but it's not clear to me. And it sounds like it's not
Yes.
clear to you in the research you've done. And certainly, yeah, go ahead.
I think I would say, just to assess a person's work, to assess Heidegger's work, we must. Well, go ahead. I'll go on this thing in a second. You go ahead with your point, and then I'll come back to actually assessing the work itself.
Yeah, go ahead. Just go right ahead right now. I'll make, if I have another point, I'll make it later.
Okay. So, with that in mind, then Martin Heidegger, yes, was a Nazi Party member, and so on and so forth. Let's take a brief discussion to discuss how we would assess that work. How do we, as philosophers, assess a work of a person? Well, I'm gonna introduce you to the 3 principles of phenomenology, which, yes, Heidegger used, but if we're gonna critique his work, we might as well use his own methodology.
You'll have to make it condense it because we only have a couple minutes. But go ahead.
So, first principle is to the things themselves. We must go back to being in time itself and analyze the text for what it is alone. All acts are interpretive is the second principle. Trying to bracket as much as humanly possible so that we can be what's the word I'm looking for, Mikey? I always mess it up, whether it's subjective or objective. Trying to be as objective as possible with no biases.
Right.
And then thirdly, Heidegger presents the idea that the world in which we all dwell in arises out of a fundamental commitment. So with that in mind, very, very briefly, let's take a 5-second look at Heidegger's main concepts. I've told you of Dasein in a very condensed form. That Dasein is our very being. Dasein is existence. And Dasein seeks to find meaning for that existence through possibility of which it can accept, reject, or stumble upon. This philosophy, the pursuit of knowing what it means to be human, what it means to be a person, is not harmful, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I would suggest, and I put a challenge to all my fellow philosophy students out there, take the time to read Being in Time. Take the time to sit with the text and experience it for what it is. Try to enter yourself into the text and see what it reveals. Because Being in Time was fundamental for the development of the school of phenomenology. And so I would argue, even if there are glimpses which no one has found, even though connections have tried to be made, which would make me greatly sad if it was, it is important to not judge a work on a person's actions, but rather what they bring to a discipline. So, the Chinese room thought experiment, Being in Time, what it means to exist, what it means to experience life, those are very beautiful but very important aspects of human existence. I think it is a shame to throw those out.
Okay, thank you, Tagen. We're actually out of time. You made a great analysis, and we'll leave it to our listeners to decide for themselves where they stand. It's a complicated thing, and kind of comes back to this idea of the genetic fallacy. When do we, and when do we, and under what circumstances would we either throw out somebody's work, or on the other side give too much how would you say, legitimacy to somebody's work because of who they are and other things they've done in their lives. Thank you very much, Tagen Marshall, philosophy student at Vancouver Island University. I'm Michael Robert Caditz, and thank you for listening to the Canadian Philosophy Show.